Hi there, I'm Dr. Victoria Mattingly, and this is Better Humans at Work. Robert Keating is a doctoral student in the Social and IO Psychology program at Northern Illinois University. His research focuses on inclusion in the workplace, specifically what it means to feel included, contextual factors that influence those feelings, and when and how inclusion benefits workers and organizations. He's also examined the role of inclusion in improving experiences of workers with disabilities and those with concealable stigmatized identities. Robert is entering a visiting assistant professor of psychology position at the Illinois Institute of Technology starting in August 2021. Rob and I nerded out on what it means to define inclusion. What I realized early on in starting my company is that there's a lot of discrepancies on how inclusion should be defined, what it means to include others. Is inclusion an outcome? Is it a behavior? And so we really dig into this and just nerd out on it in this episode. We also end with 3 pointers of what can be done from a scientific standpoint to foster more inclusion in organizations. I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, here's Robert Keating and I talking about what it means to measure and define inclusion. Hi, Rob, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm super excited because whenever we built the series, and the vision for it was to have both a scientist and practitioner perspective, and you are our first academic on the show, so welcome.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to represent the research side of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. And so I'm so curious about your personal journey into getting into inclusion research. So can you tell us a little about how you wound up doing this line of research?
Yeah. I made a career shift, kind of midlife. I was, working in the construction industry and decided that I wanted a change, and enrolled in college and got really interested in psychology pretty much right off the bat, and really interested in the research process. Once I learned about that, that was it. It was pretty much all downhill from there. And I just had a really influential professor who was an IO psychologist, and he brought me on board with some projects. He did some research in diversity and inclusion and kind of introduced me to that topic. They were things that were kind of part of my values anyway, and it just it was a good meshing of those sort of core values that I had, but then also they kind of made psychology research click for me. All the pieces sort of came together with learning about it through doing research on diversity and inclusion issues in the workplace. And that's how I ended up doing this kind of work. And I decided from then on that I want to go to grad school. I want to do research in this topic area, and here I am.
I love it. A few things in there. First off, industrial organizational psychology. How would you define that for the listeners out there?
So the easiest definition that I give to people who ask what that is it's psychology applied to the workplace. So if we think of psychology as the study of human thought, feeling, and behavior, it's the study of human thought, feeling, and behavior as it relates to the workplace. And of course, that's a really broad definition. That could encompass so many things. The way we sort of create selection devices for hiring decisions, and do, break down jobs like in a job analysis by their component parts, all that really technical stuff. And then it can also encompass sort of the more social side of what goes on in the workplace, which is the part that I'm interested in. So that's the organizational side.
I love that. And I call it out. I too, that's our shared background is IO psychology, but I feel like people don't know what it is. And when we explain what it is, they always go, oh, we need you at our organization. So always trying to plug IO. The second thing that you said, just to call out, I have a lot of students or prospective students that reach out to me and ask about programs and whatnot. And I always say, choose your faculty more than you choose your program, right? Because that really ends up dictating what your experience is, what your line of research is. So I love that it was this professor and the research that he was doing that really inspired you and led you down your inclusion research journey. And the third, I'd love to dig in a little more into what you meant by your core values. Because I always say when it comes to doing this work, especially when I work with executives, it's mindset and actions, right? It's not just the business case, but it's who you are and what your values are. And I'm curious, what are some of those core values stories that you have that really align with the research that you're doing on inclusion?
Yeah, so at a really broad level, the workplace has always just really interested me because we spend, the majority of our lives there. And it's really, I've always approached it from sort of a social psychology perspective. Um, it's a really sort of fixture in our lives, this sort of social environment that we're embedded in, for the majority of our lives. So that part always really interested me. The other side of that is, and this is really more related to how I got into diversity and inclusion research, is those are topics that have always interested me. They're things that I've always been concerned about just on a personal level. Again, like I mentioned before, I came from the construction industry, which at times can be a really hostile environment in terms of, the way certain individuals are treated, things like discrimination and stuff like that, and sort of witnessing those things firsthand. And as a white male, I've never been, the target of any of those things myself, but kind of seeing those things unfold, it sort of created this vigilance in my mind that, okay, things like this might be happening in the workplace. They are happening in the workplace. What can we do to sort of fix those things? So that's sort of how I, in addition to learning about these topics from that influential professor, it's like, okay, now how does this fit in with things that I really am passionate about and want to learn about and help fix?
Yeah, I love that. I too share, my that background of having the previous career, not construction, but service industry and working in restaurants, and just being like, we get treated poorly by customers. We have these, very erratic coworkers at times, bad bosses. And why isn't anyone helping us be, better humans? And, when it comes to emotional intelligence or how we're treating each other, communication. And I feel like so many of those come out and I'm able to really implement when it comes to DEI work. And, at the root of it, it's really just helping us all be better humans and to treat each other better with that diversity lens in mind. And the point you made, as a white male, not always being the target of, those microaggressions and that discrimination. But I love that you are a white male doing this work, because for inclusion to take hold, we all have a role to play, even though your role is very specific in the research space, which I would love to dig into more about. So one thing I realized really early on in starting my company was, having conversations, and I was having the wrong conversation. I started meeting with prospective clients and asking them, how do you measure inclusion, right? And then I realized, oh my gosh, I need to take a step back and asking, how do you define inclusion? And it was mind blowing to me that people hold roles, like whole DEI roles, where they're in charge of executing, the vision, the strategy, the programming, and they struggled over defining what inclusion is. And so, Rob, the $1 million question, how do you define inclusion? What are you seeing in the literature to really have that scientific backing of that definition?
That is definitely the $1 million question, and it's an issue that's kind of plagued the inclusion literature, and sort of been the driving force of where the conceptual development of inclusion has gone. So you hit the nail on the head. It's defined so many different ways and operationalized so many different ways, that anybody who's trying to get a handle on the inclusion literature, it's a daunting task. It really is, and it creates a lot of confusion around exactly what inclusion is. I think the overall goal is, all sort of going in the same direction, but the way that we operationalize it varies so much, that to pinpoint one way to define inclusion as a practice is kind of difficult. I think a really important development in the literature has been sort of taking that idea and using that to develop a definition of inclusion from the individual experience, from that internal psychological experience. And that's where we get these concepts of belonging. I hear a lot in the practice space, they refer to it as belonging. In the academic literature, some of the developments which suggest that inclusion is, from an internal experience, is defined by these fundamental needs we have as humans to both belong on one hand and assimilate with our groups, but then also be recognized as individuals and be valued for our authentic selves. So those are sort of the core components, at least at the internal psychological level, that would would drive what inclusion is. Now, what feeds into that? What are the sort of contextual antecedents to that?
Mhm.
That's where we have all this sort of variation in the literature and all these different definitions. Things like inclusive leadership, diversity climate, diversity practices, just even something simple as individuals, interacting in a respectful way with each other, or consoling a coworker in a time of distress. These are all things that can be considered inclusive practices. So to define all those would be, again, a really daunting task, but if we can sort of simplify it a little bit and say, okay, all these different practices, they might filter into this sort of universal psychological experience, it kind of simplifies things a little bit. And I think now we're getting to the point where, yeah, the practice of inclusion is way out in the lead of where research is on it.
Mm.
So we're kind of picking up some of the slack. Now we're kind of in a position where we could say, okay, we have a pretty good idea that this is what's going on at the internal level. Now maybe we could take a step back and sort of design policies or even check policies or practices that are currently established and see that they sort of can kind of be validated by by examining relationships between them and that sort of internal sense of inclusion.
So many things
That was a
there.
long-winded definition, but
Yeah, so many pieces in there. And so what I'm hearing is inclusion really is in the eye of the beholder. It's the outcome of a variety of different factors. And so here at Mattingly Solutions, we talk about inclusion in terms of behaviors, just because, to help our clients really have an actionable next step. And we can, as IO psychologists, we can measure behaviors, we can have interventions to result in behavior change. We can hold people accountable for behaviors when it comes to performance evaluation, performance management. And so we like to say inclusion are the behaviors that result in others feeling valued, respected, seen, and heard. So it's still getting at that outcome. And from the literature, I think a really great seminal piece, and we'll make sure to include this in the comments or in the description below, was the seminal piece by Shore et al. Talking about inclusion in terms of two factors, and you have to hit both. You have to both have the uniqueness factor, and that gets at what you mentioned before about I could bring my authentic self into work. My unique self, my authentic self is seen and heard and valued, and I feel like I belong. And you need both those factors, right? Because if you have to change who you are, code switch, act like a different person to belong, you're missing on the uniqueness factor. If you can let your freak flag fly at work and be who you are, but not fit in or not even get hired in the first place, right? Because you don't have culture fit or whatnot, then that's not inclusion either. And so I think that's a nice way of simplifying sort of that outcome of both uniqueness and belonging. I think that was a really great seminal piece in the field.
yeah.
But you're absolutely right. There's so many factors that feed into it. And I think that's why companies struggle so much with how to make sense of inclusion, how to drive it, how to foster it. So what have been some, practical applications that you've recommended in your work, especially when, fostering more inclusive cultures? What are some of those? I always go when I read academic papers, I always go right to the practical implications after I read the abstract and see, okay, what are they telling us to do? Well, how is this research going to help change the world by, being able to be applied in some practical way? So I'm curious what you've been either reading or writing in regard to those practical applications of inclusion.
Yeah, so that's actually a tricky question because, like I was saying before, the research is kind of behind. So the cart is a little bit before the horse. What folks have been doing in the practice space is kind of light years beyond what we're doing in the research space. So we're still kind of having the same conversations that we've been having for the last 10 years about thinking about. So the big questions in diversity and inclusion are, or the big insights are, inclusion is different than diversity. So that's something that we heard so many times over and over again, or that there's a business case for inclusion. And these are questions that have been still being addressed for the last 10 years or so. So the research space hasn't really advanced too much in terms of being able to make those practical recommendations. So there's something I think what would be nice is if there was a little bit more sort of interaction between people who are in the research space and people who are in the practice space to exchange those ideas. Because this is one of those kind of rare things we tend to think of translational research as we've already have this great foundation of foundational research where we understand sort of the theory behind the concept, and now we can turn that into ways that we can make practical applications from that understanding. But we don't really have that super strong foundational research. We have some stuff from social psychology that's been informing what we know about the feeling of inclusion. And that's the short all stuff that you've been talking about. But we haven't really gone as far as testing that framework, testing those theories, the hypotheses that come from that in order to advance that towards where we can start to make those practical suggestions. Most of the practical implications that, at least that I've seen, have come from talks at like PSYOP and AOM and stuff like that from practitioners, individuals in that practitioner space who have been, working with organizations on, different inclusion and diversity initiatives that they've been working on and different ways that they've been measuring it. So the practice of inclusion is one of those tricky things, and then compound that by the fact that there's so many different ways that we can practice inclusion. How do we sort of identify what are the most effective practices or the best ones to use? And I don't think there's a really straightforward answer to that. It could really depend beyond just, some minimal compliance practices that get at a minimum, fairness and equity and legal compliance. Those are things that all organizations should be doing. But once we get to those more elevated types of inclusion practices, that can really vary by organization, that's where it becomes more of a specific, okay, what do we want to accomplish as an organization? What are our goals that we're trying to do in terms of inclusion?
Yeah, and then there's even like different levels and also different groups, like the diversity part of inclusion. And so one thing that we help our clients look at is not just the, what are behaviors being enacted, and what's that sentiment of belonging as a result, but also how do those measures vary by group, right? And in the work that I do in allyship, I started my allyship research journey in the gender space, and that was my dissertation that really got me launched into doing DEI work. And allyship in a gender context is very different compared to allyship in a racial context, right? And because there's racial implications, there's a lot of history of patriarchy and misogyny, but then there's a whole other history of racism and discrimination, especially here in our country, and all those contextual and historical factors feed into this. And even just the differences in what allyship behaviors look like in a gender context is that there's some transferable aspects, but it's a very different case. And then you look at organizational level, and what's happening in one organization is very different than another, and where different companies are on their DEI journey. There's just so many factors. But something you said earlier about, this distinction between diversity and inclusion and how that's a big topic in the DEI literature. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I wanted to get your reaction to this. But the argument, at least in the applied world, is you need inclusion for diversity to stick. But I would also say that you would need diversity for inclusion to really be possible. And so I'm curious if you've seen, does one predict the other? Do they both predict each other? Like, how are these two concepts related when it comes to things like, structural equation modeling or regression? If you've seen any sort of insights in that when it comes to the research.
Yeah, I think those are both valid sort of perspectives, whichever direction you're thinking about that. I think we're sort of geared for thinking about inclusion as necessary for diversity to work, because that's the concept of inclusion and diversity management more broadly. It's sort of come from, okay, we need a way to respond to inevitable increases in workforce diversity.
Yeah.
Diversity is happening. We know diversity alone may lead to negative outcomes in terms of team cohesion and performance and stuff like that. At least from a social identity perspective, we need something to sort of make sure that doesn't happen and make sure we can sort of drive some benefits from diversity, and that's where inclusion comes from, basically. But at the same time, diversity is sort of at least a degree of diversity in an organization can be a proxy of inclusion. It could be an indicator that's okay. This organization is not only maybe espousing that they have, inclusive hiring and, recruitment policies, but they're actually enacting those policies and practices in hiring a diverse workforce, making an effort towards that. So I think it's valid to think of inclusion as a response to diversity, but then also that it is an outcome of diversity too.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I just love how much work there is to be in this space. And I want to say to you personally, but also to those watching out there, the point you made about more collaborations across the scientist practitioner divide and how we can work more collaboratively together to better understand inclusion from a scientific perspective, but also being able to embed evidence-based strategies into doing this work and helping organizations, not just throw things against the wall and see what sticks, but to be able to draw from the research and say, these are the 5 things, at least start when it comes to fostering workplace inclusion. And so, speaking of which, what would be 3 tips that you would give, Rob, to all those watching out there who want to drive inclusion at their organization?
One thing, and this is something that really is sort of the driving force of my dissertation work, is being precise about what we mean by inclusion. So we do tend to think of inclusion, as you mentioned before, as behaviors, as the actions of an organization. And then, of course, as we covered, that those actions can vary extensively. But sometimes we conflate that with the idea of an internal experience of inclusion. So like the belonging and authenticity piece and those need satisfactions. So thinking about those as, they are related concepts, but also separate. And how that might drive whatever our goals might be in an organization. So if we want to learn about the effectiveness of certain inclusive behaviors, sure, we can measure those behaviors and measure perceptions of those behaviors and the degree to which our employees, notice those behaviors or can confirm or agree that those exist in the organization. But then how are we determining the effectiveness of that in the sense of, okay, this is an inclusive practice or an inclusive policy. Sure, we could relate that to, different job attitudes or different well-being outcomes, which is, what's been pretty much done in the literature. But how does that relate to the actual feeling of inclusion that individuals might experience in response to those cues? So that's something I think to be vigilant about and think about those things as separate, but very, very much connected concepts, and measure those things separately. The other thing about that is, okay, if we're defining inclusion in these different ways, thinking about it more specifically about, okay, how might these behaviors or actions manifest differently based on different levels of the organization? So when you're actually going to implement these practices, a practice at the organizational level might be very different than a practice at the individual level or the leader level. So we think of the organization as sort of the more sweeping policies and practices when we're defining inclusion. But then at the individual level, they might be more specific behaviors, the way we treat each other, the way, respectful treatment or how we interact with each other, our interaction styles, and things like that. So the precision with which we're kind of thinking about inclusion, and then how we're defining inclusion across those different levels. And then also when we actually get to the point where we want to implement different inclusion strategies or inclusion initiatives, who's actually at the table for those decisions? So one of the probably major components of an inclusion practice, at least that's been identified in the literature, is that the degree to which employees have some stake in decision making. They can influence decisions that are made and affect the organization, and their input is solicited. But not to get too meta here, but how much are we thinking about that in terms of decisions that we make surrounding inclusion? Who's at the table for those decisions? Something that I think is inclusive may be very different than something that a non-white female thinks is inclusive, or somebody who may have a disability or some functional limitation thinks of inclusive. Those policies or practices might differ pretty extensively by individual. And something you mentioned before that kind of gets at that is how we perceive inclusion, and is there group differences with the way we perceive it? And there very well may be. The research suggests that mean levels of how our perceptions of inclusion climate in our organization might differ depending on things like race or gender or disability status and things like that. And might even get to the level of where we're interpreting those cues, those different inclusion actions in the organization differently. We might not see them as inclusive as somebody else might see another type of, or the same thing. They might witness the same thing and not interpret that the same way.
Yep. And so having precision around inclusion, especially when it comes to definitions, measurement, and across various levels, making sure the right people are at the table when it comes to decisions around, what inclusive practices can be. And then finally, and this kind of gets at the previous point you made, but, really embedding inclusion into those practices, into policy, thinking about it when you're talking about levels, like, what does inclusion look like at the policy level, and how do we embed, systemic change and systemic inclusion into organizations? I think that's super important as well. And the point you made about levels really brought that home for me personally. Yeah. Rob, this is amazing. How can people get in touch with you if they want to continue this conversation and nerd out with you, just like I did about inclusion?
Yeah, I'm always happy to have discussions about this stuff. I love it. So happy to nerd out on anytime. You can access me on LinkedIn below, or you feel free to email me at robkeating@outlook.com.
Love it. Thank you for making yourself so accessible to all the fellow inclusion measurement and scholars or wannabe scholars out there. The work you're doing is so important. Thank you for advocating for inclusion through your work and helping us understand what the science of inclusion is and how we can apply it to the workplace. So thank you so much for joining us today and everything you're doing to help improve the human experience at work.